Hello everybody, and today I'm going to be doing something a little different, sort of like with my mythology video, but today I was thinking about doing something that I have not seen yet, although some of you might have realized this on your own accord, but the Celts in many ways were, how do I put this, the true predecessors to medieval Europe. Now, many of you might think that the Romans or perhaps the Germans, the Germanic tribes that conquered almost all of Europe after the quote unquote fall of Rome, was the predecessors, and in some ways you'd be right. They did have a lot of their culture added on, but in a lot of ways, the medieval times in general were like a progression or a step up from, or maybe even a step down from the Celtic culture. Let's think about this for a moment. Unlike the Renaissance, and by medieval I mean like the Dark Ages to like 13 maybe 1400. Okay, so the Renaissance. In the Renaissance, there were starting to at least be full blown armies. Kings had complete power, and except for Britain, of course, and states were getting hungrier and hungrier for land and power and everything. I mean, they always were, but it was just sort of a one up of all these things at this time. But during the medieval period, and no matter how you want to classify it, the period between about 600 and 13 or 1400, there were some qualities of life, something called feudalism, which I've heard people like, I think it was Shadiversity, who said that it wasn't really so clearly cut, and I can see that, especially since stuff like chivalry wasn't exactly one thing either. But the Celts, for example, the the noblemen, for example, it was sort of like feudalism in the way that you had like kind of a high chief or king, Rich or Riges. There would be the king who had power, certainly, but he didn't have power over a certain, like his entire tribe. He just sort of ruled over the rulers who ruled over his tribe. A high king, if you will, sort of like Brian Boru and later years of Celtic society. And then you had the noblemen, who would be the ones that were really sort of controlling each of their little lands. And the peasants, if you will, sure had more freedom during the Celtic times, which is why I sort of said it was a step down maybe in medieval times. But for the most part, they had the same role in society. They were craftsmen and farmers, mostly farmers. And rather than having fully fledged armies, each group would sort of raise a local militia from the people in the area. A system that I thought was actually pretty great. Well, unless you got Romans, that is. Uh, Romans at your doorstep, in which case you want a fully fledged army. But, what am I getting at? What I'm getting at is that in a lot of ways, history did repeat itself between the years of 800 BC to like 10 BC, or however many years Gallic culture survived, and then from 600 AD to 1300 AD in a lot of ways. And even religiously, Now you might say, but polytheism wasn't that big of a thing in the 1300s unless you're going to the Baltic states. But that's not what I mean. What I mean is, like medieval Europe, the religious people, the druids, that is, the druids had a lot of power in their own right. If you want to look at Celtic society as sort of a power pyramid or triangle, then you have the chieftain at the top, the noblemen below them, or actually maybe the druids. The druids and the noblemen with sort of like a cut line in between them in the next part of the pyramid. And then you have the craftsmen and farmers, or maybe the craftsmen and farmers are jumbled together. But either way, that is the same system you have in medieval Europe, except the druids you replace with the priest, the Catholic Church. But unlike the Catholic Church, the druids sort of were not completely one organization, even if they did tend to meet together across tribal boundaries, even during times of war. They were almost like their own organization, and no one really ruled over them for probably good reason, or well, good reason in the minds of those who were there, like the chief. Why would you want to rule over someone who could have the gods curse you? I'm sure they still had to follow some laws and certain taxations or whatever they had, but they were, for the most part, their own independent thing, sort of like the Catholic Church was in medieval Europe. That makes me wonder if they had their own land. I've heard mentioned just the Carnutian Forest, especially from the Eluveti song. That was that like the Papal States to the Druids? We don't know. We can't know, really. It's an interesting thought, however. And that makes me wonder, from how far exactly did Druids travel to meet together? From Ireland all the way to Gaul? I mean, sure, modern day that wouldn't be that long of a journey, but back then it probably was, especially if you were from like Ulster or modern Ulster, probably called something different at the time, or if you were from Pictlin per se, or from Galicia, like in northwest Iberia, or Galicia in central Turkey. Did they all travel all the way to northern France to meet up? It's an interesting thought, in my opinion. Well, that's really all I got for today. Oh, except one thing I forgot, and that is they almost sort of had the predecessors to knights, too, with the cavalry. In fact, the word in Welsh for knight comes from Old Celtic marcacos, which means horseman, which is an old term we can tell, at least from the 500s, before the change from sort of an older form of Common Brythonic to a newer form, because of the way that the vowels interact during the whole change. Well, besides that, that's all I got for today, and if you got any thoughts about that, I'd love to discuss it with you in the comments. I sure do, with other YouTubers like Sanctuary of Lug or Shadiversity or any of them. And that's all for now. See you later.